We are back and we are joined now by Omar Akkad, award-winning journalist and novelist, author of his latest, One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. The title is pretty self-explanatory, but Omar, thanks so much for coming on the show.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course. First of all, I can promise you that this would be the first, maybe the first, one of your only media interviews on this book that you won't be asked to condemn Hamas. So I think you're in good hands here.
But I had the statement ready. All right, fine. I guess we'll make do.
We'll make do. So you were born in Cairo. Your book kind of interweaves your personal story, coming to the West as a teenager, coming to Canada, where you've been in both worlds, right? And you had like this shift in your world, but you had the mental clarity being an older kid at that point to kind of see some of those differences in coming to the United States, to Canada. Just tell us a little bit about that transition, what your conception of Western values were versus how you experienced them when coming to the United States.
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
Canada. I keep saying United States.
I mean, I ended up in the U.S. eventually, about
Yes.
11, 12 years ago. So it's a bit of a circuitous route, right? Because I'm born in Egypt. My dad has to get the hell out of Egypt when I'm 5 years old. And so we moved to Qatar, which, pound for pound is the richest place on earth. And if you've never been, it's a very relatively surreal lifestyle. If you're not among the migrant laborer class who are treated like absolute dirt, if you're sort of middle class and up, it's the easiest life in the world, in large part because you're stepping on the necks of the folks who actually sort of built the place. But if you're not sort of born into a Qatari family, you can't stay in Qatar permanently. You're always in a kind of precarious situation where your visa could be revoked or, so on and so forth. And so we had planned on that happening, and my dad had decided to start the immigration process to Canada. At the time, he couldn't point out Canada on the map. It was just sort of the next destination, because once you leave your home, that's kind of the life you live. You're looking for the next harbor. And the way I thought of Canada specifically, the US, the West generally, was as a kind of harbor. To me, it wasn't so much a place as a kind of negation. When you grow up in a place like Qatar, everything is censored, for example. I have these formative memories of holding up copies of Newsweek to the light to try and see past the black ink that the censor had used to block off whatever was, deemed too dangerous for me to read. And so my first impression of the West was essentially just a negation of that. I don't care what this place is, but at least I can go there and I don't have to deal with this. And for the most part, that is what it was for me when I first show up to Canada. I go to the library and I can ask for any book I want, and I don't have to worry about the possibility of getting deported if it's the wrong thing or, that sort of thing. And for the majority of my life in this part of the world, that was enough. I could deal with everything else. I could deal with the racism. I could deal with the sort of petty indignities because I had that. And I think the book, in large part, is about the moment where that trade-off wasn't something I could do anymore, where the price I was paying for that became too high for me to bear.
And that threshold, was that crossed in the environment after October 7th? I mean, what was that feeling like for you to kind of see? We experienced it covering it on the show. The immediate aftermath of the Hamas attack was this whole display of this ramp up of what the genocide was going to look like. And I think we all foresaw that it was going to be a genocidal slaughter. I don't know if we could have foreseen it being a year and 8 months long, and us having basically no idea, being completely in the dark at this point about how many are dead. I mean, it's in the hundreds of thousands. And yet there's still this Western narrative that it's 58 or it's 60,000 people. Like the slaughter that we've seen, it was quite obvious, and that's what the title of your book is, a version of a tweet that you put out that went viral. It was quite obvious in the weeks following.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the way I've been describing it is in terms of this break, at least personally for me, I've been describing it the same way that sort of Hemingway's characters went bankrupt, little by little and then all at once. I was a journalist for 10 years, and there were things that I saw that if I was a less cowardly person would have probably brought me to this break much sooner. You go to Afghanistan and you see the local soldiers being put on the front lines of every forward operating base such that if the attack comes, they're the ones who die, not the NATO soldiers. You see the hierarchy of human life. You go to Guantanamo, you see this ad hoc legal system in violation of all normal sort of legal modes, designed purely to get these convictions. And in every case, I was able to compartmentalize and to say, yes, there's something kind of rotten here, but it's just this moment, and it's just this situation. It's unique to this. And I think what has happened over the last 20 months is that my ability to compartmentalize has imploded. I keep coming back to the same three factors that make this different for me. And those are sort of intimacy, immediacy, and complicity. I wake up every morning, and within moments of the horrible thing happening, I see it. Little kids starving to death, toddlers torn apart by the force of these bombs. There's an intimacy and there's an immediacy to it that if I was a perfect human being, probably shouldn't matter, right? What's wrong is wrong, regardless of how immediate or intimate it might be. But it does matter that I see it so closely. And then thirdly, there's the complicity, right? My tax dollars are doing this, right? I'm killing those kids. That's me. And so it becomes impossible to ignore in the way that I so successfully ignored these things previously. That's what's changed for me. And it's not like these currents weren't present before. You don't even have to look to Afghanistan or to Guantanamo Bay. You can look to Gaza itself. This place has been an open-air prison for years and years and years, and nobody cared. On October 6th of 2023, a report came out detailing how deadly a year it was for Palestinian children. That's never the starting point of any narrative around this, but it existed, and I was able to ignore it. And that's a function of the kind of human being I am. That's a function of the obliviousness that largely carried me through my existence in the West and has largely fallen apart now.
Well, I think, it's not a moral failing. It's more just what's engendered in us as a part of being in the West. We have an ivory tower kind of view of the other parts of the global South and the Middle East that we exploit. But it's the other part that's so striking in your book is like, it's even in the title when we're talking about this moral rot of Western liberalism, which I want to get into even more specifically, but just the idea that people can't see historical parallels or feel this immense guilt about being on the wrong side of history. Your analysis of this moment, can you speak a little bit more about the inconsistency of things like, how we speak about the Holocaust and never again, and then the silence of some of those same people as this genocide is not being done? We don't read about it the next day in the newspaper. We see it every day on our phone.
I think for me, the best I've been able to answer that kind of question has to do with the sort of reward and punishment equilibrium. With respect to something like the suffering of the Palestinian people, certainly where I live out on the West Coast. I think this is true of most of the United States, if not the Western world at large. There is essentially no consequence to pretending none of this is happening. I wake up every day and I open my computer and I see evidence of the worst things human beings can do to one another. And then I go about my day and it's as though none of this is happening. And there's emails that need to be replied to, and there's bills that need to be paid, and there are Zoom meetings that need to drag on endlessly, and you need to do the stuff. And in fact, not only is there no consequence for the vast majority of the people that I'm around at any given moment to thinking about any of this, there's an immense punishment waiting if you do think about this too much, and if you do talk about this too much. I was on tour for this book for 2.5 months, and at virtually every event, somebody would come up to me afterwards and say, this is the first space where I've been able to sit with this, where I've been able to think about this. Because if I talk about this at work, I might get fired. If I talk about this with my friends, they might stop being my friends. And it's not, they're not there at this event because they love me or they love the book. They don't care about any of that. It's just a place where you can feel like you're not losing your mind. And so I think a lot of this makes perfect sense if you have conditioned yourself to believe that Palestinians are not sufficiently human. And once you do that, you're good.
How has that conditioning made itself manifest in the West? There's a lot of discussion about anti-Semitism in this country. Anti-Jewish hate is a real thing, but a great majority of the instances that are cited are protests against Zionism and the genocide. And I can name dozens of think pieces that I've seen just in the last month on that very topic. And yet Islamophobia, which, even in the word, right, it sounds like you're afraid of spiders. But Islamophobia is the most pernicious and widespread bigotry in our country right now. And it crosses traditional political lines where when we're talking about Western liberalism, there's this kind of hollowness of performing virtue and doing so in basically an explicitly domestic context about groups that have been marginalized historically in this country. But when that looks outward and expands to the consequences of capitalism and imperialism, of which the Gaza genocide is both, why is that analysis failing, and why is it in the end so racist in outcome with so many of these people who would balk at that idea if it was applied to Black people here domestically, Latino people, etc.?
There's a couple of things that come to mind. First and foremost, we live in an incredibly anti-Semitic part of the world. The current administration is rife with raging anti-Semites. I know that it's sort of been buried under God knows how many scandals and outrages now, but it wasn't that long ago that we were sitting around trying to discern whether one of the central figures in this administration was actually making a Nazi salute or not. This isn't subtle stuff. I think that is separate from a patently disingenuous effort to conflate criticism of a state that is currently engaged in an act of genocide with anti-Jewish hatred. I think that is a patently bad faith effort. But it doesn't change the fact that we do live in an incredibly anti-Semitic part of the world. I think with respect to Islamophobia, one of the reasons that it has essentially no effect is because it can have no effect. The consequences of this country or this part of the world genuinely caring about anti-Muslim or anti-Arab hatred are too immense to ponder. Because the second we decide that these human beings, of which I am one, are sufficiently human such as to warrant actual response to this hatred, we're not just contending with the random stuff that's like yelled at me every now and then on the street. We're not just contending with angry comments on Twitter from Freedom Eagle 1776 at Hotmail or whatever, right? We are contending with wholesale slaughter, right? Which is happening right now. And how do you go about sort of admitting to yourself that this is the consequence of the thing you've allowed to fester? I think just at a societal level, at a governmental level, once you start thinking of these human beings as being sufficiently human to warrant condemnation, the thing you have to condemn is so overwhelming and so all-encompassing and so all-indicting as to essentially require something much, much bigger than a statement of apology or, some declaration of regret or something. And so I think that's part of it. And honestly, part of it is proximity to whiteness. Right?
Yes.
And I know full well that I get very different reactions depending on whether the first thing someone hears about me is this accent or whether they read my name first. Those
Right.
are two entirely different human beings, primarily because this accent has a proximity to whiteness and this name doesn't. And I know I have to live with that. That's the calculus of my existence in this part of the world, and that's not going to change overnight.
This is a good way, I think, to transition to this poll I saw. I'm curious about your take on this, Omar. Yesterday, Haaretz, the Israeli paper, wrote about this article, this study that was conducted by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So this is done by the university. This the Zionists will say, "Oh, Haaretz, it's so liberals, right?" Nope, they're just reposting what the study found, reporting on it, and you can't count on other Israeli media to do that. So 64% of Israelis see no need for more reporting on Gazan suffering, is what the poll found. Now, we should say that this includes Arab Israelis in this total. So in terms of Jewish Israelis, it's higher than 64% who see no need to cover Gaza's suffering anymore. If we could go to the paragraph, according to the survey conducted by Dr. Boaz Sherki and Lee Aldar, 64% of Israelis believe that the local media's reporting on Gaza has been balanced and there is no need to present a broader picture regarding the situation of Gaza's civilians. 89% of the people that support the Netanyahu government have that view. But the other question is, if we could scroll down a little bit more here, this is good. 41% of all respondents said that the news on Israel's two mainstream commercial stations, channels 12 and 13, are biased in favor of the population of Gaza. So that is the plurality opinion. But scroll down even more, because that's insane. But there's even more. Okay, here we go. Actually, no, down a little bit more. Thank you. Here it is. Another question asked in the Akkad poll was, to what extent respondents agreed with the statement that there are no innocent people in Gaza? 64% agreed with it to a large extent, describing their agreement as between 4 and 6 on a scale in which 1 is total disagreement and 6 is complete agreement. So this is the top 50th percentile in terms of strength of response. 64% agree with the statement there are no innocent people in Gaza. And then the last piece of the poll that I think is important is on this paragraph. When it comes to Israelis' views of foreign media outlets, which for the purposes of the polling refer to CNN and the BBC, 69% of respondents said they were biased in favor of Palestinians in Gaza. Even when asked about Fox News, which is identified with the American right wing, half of those polled, and 67% of voters for coalition parties, said it was biased in favor of Gazans. I just want people to sit with that for just a second. 69% of overall Israelis think CNN and BBC's coverage, and here in the United States, we're intimately aware with CNN's coverage, and Dana Bash and Jake Tapper pushing the pro-Israel narrative over and over and over again. 69% of Israelis think they're biased in favor of Palestinians, and half of Israelis think Fox News is biased in favor of Palestinians. What do you make of those numbers? What does it say about the West and Israeli society's role in it?
I mean, honestly, there's something refreshing about it, because there isn't this sort of attempt to hide behind a narrative that clearly has no connection with reality. One of the ironic things about that study is that if you were to try to essentially write a news story about that and run it in most of these Western publications that are considered too biased in favor of Palestinians, you either wouldn't get it on the air or you'd get fired for it. It would be considered too inflammatory. And this is true of a lot of stuff that runs in Israeli media and runs plainly without any real controversy. That would be considered far too controversial to run in the Western world. I mean, one way to think about this is imagine living in Israeli society right now and not holding those views. How incredibly frustrating an experience that must be. This is essentially a viewpoint that is in line with the reality of what is happening. Obviously, in the most overt way over the last 20 months, but also over the last 70 plus years. The non-existence of the Palestinian people is central to a particular narrative of Israeli life. And again, if that sounds controversial, fine, but it's in line with the reality of the situation.
It's an ethno-state maintained by violence and domination, and some people, a majority of Israeli society wants the violence and domination to continue to maintain the ethnic purity of the state.
And I mean, look, and if all this stuff, makes your viewers or your listeners uncomfortable, fine. Ignore Israel entirely. Name me one colonial outpost in history that was able to maintain its colonial narrative while simultaneously maintaining a narrative in which the indigenous population that had to be displaced or eradicated was of equal value. Their lives were of equal value. It doesn't exist. It certainly does not exist in the United States. It only exists in hindsight. It only exists 100 or 200 years later when, the Obama administration can issue this declaration saying sorry about all the genocide. And, my book is titled what it's titled for a reason, right? Because we're going to get around to that place. We're not there yet. And so to me, first of all, this isn't the first poll of its kind. This is obviously sort of incredibly heightened because of the moment we're in, but there's a very long history of these kinds of opinions being in place, and they sort of have to be, right? There's no way somebody can imply that a situation in which quite literally millions of Palestinians live in open-air prisons where their every movement is subjected to control by the Israeli military, where they have to carry different ID cards and travel down different roads and take different buses, there's no way somebody can imply that that is an equal landscape from which to build peace. That just doesn't exist. And I think, honestly, it's sort of refreshing to just see that statement outright instead of hearing some State Department spokesperson talk to me about the desire for equal peace and equal justice, as all the while my tax money is funding this incredible glaring asymmetry.
And this is why it has to come from the outside, like it had to do in South Africa and in Rhodesia. And the differences, I think, in those instances are, one, the level of militarization and bombing is not anywhere close. But two, white people were definitely demographic minorities. The anxiety, too, within Israel is the idea that it's more like 50-50 if you were to incorporate Palestinians into official statehood, not just under occupation and control and as third-class citizens that they're now slaughtering. So I guess that's a good way, I think, for us to wrap here. What we're in this place right now. The Mamdani campaign here in New York is very exciting, and he went on TV and he talked about, when being asked about his views about Israel, they said, "Do you believe as a Jewish state that you support it?" And he said he supports it as a state of equal rights. And this is, I think, a really important divergence from liberalism, which has been maintaining this two-state solution myth for longer than my lifetime. And it's so untenable at this point, but our politicians on the national level have completely not caught up to it. Can you speak about the contradiction of liberalism's support for Israel as an ethno-state, especially when you compare it to, like, the multicultural values these same people espouse domestically?
Yeah, I think there's something patently exhausting about trying to maintain a sort of liberal approach to this, because you essentially have to take every other value that you claim to espouse in every other case and carve out a little exception for it. Segregation is wrong, except in this case where it's good and necessary. Apartheid is wrong, except in this case where it's good and necessary. The sort of visceral, emotional, and psychological reaction you feel when you hear about people being forced to take only certain roads, for example, has to be set aside. And over time, that is damaging, right? And I think what you're seeing right now is, at least for the first time in my lifetime, an actual political consequence to this kind of incredibly disjointed mode of liberalism, in which you hold on very vocally to a certain set of views and principles, except in one case. If you had told me, 2 years ago, that the suffering of the Palestinian people would factor in any way in the results of a US presidential election, I would have thought you were out of your mind. And now it can be argued that, at least to a certain extent, this factored in the last presidential election. That means something. There's someone who, maybe he doesn't win, but has a serious shot at becoming mayor of maybe the most important city in the country, who is finally calling out this glaring hypocrisy. Again, if you told me that 2 years ago, I would have thought you're out of your mind. And so what you're watching, I think, is a level of change, but politics, particularly sort of federal politics in this country, is a trailing metric. It takes a very long time to catch up with what the population is thinking, what people are demanding. And so, as sort of heartened as I am by just seeing the most basic acknowledgement and the most rudimentary changes, it is depressing in the sense that I think of, how many bodies between this moment and when we reach political calculus that acknowledges it. Something is changing. It's just changing very, very slowly.
And the Israelis are counting on that. It's why they're killing every journalist that they can find. It's the deadliest conflict. I hate calling it that, but that's the metrics used for journalists in history. And they've killed all the record keepers. They've killed them. And so they want to use this period of darkness, both journalistically and in terms of Gaza's capacity to count the dead and their hospital capacity to kill as many as they can in this period of time where they're doing it in somewhat secret.
I mean, look, the moment a US presidential administration makes the phone call and lets it be known that there's actual consequences to any of this and that it needs to stop, it will stop. I mean, fundamentally, this has happened in the past. This happened under Reagan, very famously. None of this happens without my tax money. None of it. And the second a solution is imposed by the United States, and I use the word imposed very deliberately here, it will come to fruition. But we have had administration after administration, year after year, decade after decade, of some White House or State Department spokesperson coming up to the podium and saying, we're so flustered and frustrated, we don't know what to do. They won't listen to us. And it's patently nonsense. And everybody knows it's nonsense. Everybody knows that the second that there are actual consequences and there's actual pressure to not engage in what is effectively wholesale slaughter, that will all come to an end. It's just a matter of waiting on whether there's enough domestic political pressure such that enough politicians make the calculation that it is in their favor or in their personal interest to consider Palestinians human. We're effectively waiting on that date. Every other argument is an attempt to employ a level of pragmatism and political calculus onto something that, at least to my mind, is as clear a moral issue as has existed in my lifetime.
Absolutely. Well, everybody should read One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. It's a beautiful book Omar, thanks so much for your time today. We'll put a link to your book below wherever people are listening to or watching this. Thanks so much. And at majority.fm.
Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.